All right, you AMDXers, listen up. Now, up on top here, sorry that the lighting isn't better, and I don't have a $40,000 lab, but this is a Trio. It's made in Japan. It's a Lafayette radio, which I used to make fun of, and then I saw that the specs on this radio are 1 microvolt, not millivolt, microvolt. Some guy over on the Shango got him to back down, had him believing that the front end of the radio is rated in millivolts. Well, millivolts is a thousandth of a volt. A microvolt is probably 1 millionth of a volt. But in other words, 1 microvolt on this antenna is a very small signal. So small that the atmospheric noise ratio to 1 millivolt, it's getting to the point where you can detect the signal, but it'll be very noisy. But once I knew this was that good, I started using this as a reference. I also used the Helicrafters SX42. I noticed it got signals that this radio wouldn't get. Now this radio is an NC57. It's the same circuit as my favorite radio of all time, which would be an NC125, same circuit, except it doesn't have the Selecto jet. So I was using this for the DX, and then I got that Hellcrafters SX42, and I noticed it was getting stations that this one wouldn't get. So then I went in and I realized I had a bad resistor on the first RF tube. But actually, I have 3 of these sets. I noticed one set worked better than the other 2. Figured out that it needed a resistor that changed value, and did that. And then I started getting the same stations with this as with the Helicrafters SX42. This is much smaller in size, so I got this out of the way. And then I remember I showed you a video where you change the front RF tube and you can get even more zip out of it. So this, once again, is my favorite DX radio that's a tube. It's a nice size. You can get them cheap on eBay. A lot of times they're rust buckets. You got to watch out. But I kept comparing everything to this. Now, I noticed today I was going through and I was checking to make sure that this radio got every station that this radio got. And I noticed that the first station I tried on this one, it was beautiful. This one, it was there, but it was extremely noisy. And I'm like, oh, do I have to go down another rabbit hole? And I did not have these radios. They're in the same outlet. They're using the same antenna, but the antennas aren't paralleled. In other words, the antenna isn't tied to both radios at once. I use a clip lead. So I'm doing the stations, and I notice this thing is a noise maker. And it's not whatever you call it, silver mica disease. This just picks up a lot. So just now, I put another 20 minutes in looking at the schematics. This radio here, in the power supply, besides having a regulator tube, it has a choke. And on either side of the choke to ground is a capacitor. And it's a very small value, probably 0.01. And that's to get any RF noise that comes in from the line cord, goes through the power supply, and it'll get in the radio. This does not have it. This has one cheesy little 0.01 across the terminals of the transformer. And there is no choke. Now I can go further on to this radio now and realize how chunky it is. See, I used to make fun of Lafayette radios because they're always sort of borderline. You someone say, I got a Lafayette, but it ain't that good. But we're back to the National NC57. It's as good as you can get a tube radio to get. And it with a 30-foot piece of wire on this, it works as good as my DX390. All right? And it's got a better speaker, so it's clearer. It's got more of a mellow tone because it's tube. So anyway, this is the radio I would recommend. Before and then once you get it working, you're DXing, then you might want to try finding a radio that's better than this, than the DX390, and report back. But right away, I'm done today. I'm going to compare the two radios, because this is 1 microvolt. I don't know what this is, but I'm thinking this thing got to be like 5 microvolts. And the story that started all this, I told you about. I hung it to Guilford Shortwave, and the woman would give me the phone to answer, and I forgot the amount of microvolts. So anyway, the one guy in there would always sell these JRC ND525 radios, and the person would buy it thinking it was going to be better than the Hallicrafters 150 or 160 at the time. That was the radio everybody DX with. And he buys the $1,000 radio, and he knows right away it's dead. It's deaf. We would call it deaf, but of course it gets AM broadcast stations, but not as good as like I told you, I have 3 or 4 stations in my head that when someone hands me a radio, I immediately dial in those 3 stations, and I can tell if it doesn't get those 3 stations, it's not a good radio for AM broadcast DX. Well, this kid would sell these radios, and later on he went and worked for the company, and they're not good for AM DX. You would expect for $1,000. Now, somebody that did repairs in that store, he said to me the reason, he says they basically take the radio and they dumb down the AM band so it won't overload. But this doesn't overload if you put a longer antenna on it. What I noticed about radios is there's an AR88 made by RCA. Now, I do believe this thing, I have a bottom panel. Hold on. I got a feeling this is an RCA patent. Oh, I got to find a pair of glasses. Hold on. It's got the patent thing on the bottom of it. I got it upside down. Hold on. Yeah. If you really get into shortwave radios, tube ones, most of them are RCA patents. Even though this is a national, there's a sticker on the bottom of this national NC57 that tells you it's an RCA patent. Now this is made in Japan, so it's a copy of this with newer tubes. It's got better sensitivity, but they cheated you in the power supply. And those 2 capacitors that this one has and the choke prevent RF from getting in from the line into the radio. That's very important when you're trying to DX a very small signal. You're pulling the signal out of the background noise. Meanwhile, this radio, the specs, 1 microvolt front end. But they don't tell you the noise. Oh, you got to have a perfectly good line cord with no noise on it. Well, that ain't going to happen these days. So this morning when I turned this on and I'm comparing the two, this thing's a noisy bird. And I'm like, oh, is this going to be hard to find? So I told you, I go for schematics right away. And I look at this set, and it's got 1.01 across the inputs of the transformer, the 110 input to the transformer. Then no transformer, no choke. I'm like, that has got a resistor. Like that's garbage. So then, anyway, so I go back to this one, and this one has 2 capacitors, and they're across a choke. And the choke only lets DC go through it. So any kind of RF noise, those 2 little capacitors on either side of that choke, put them to ground, the RF. And any other kind of noises, spikes and stuff, the choke takes care of from getting in the radio. It's still going to be there through the air. So it was pretty amazing. I'm like, I didn't want to go not down another rabbit hole. I didn't want to spend another 2 or 3 days trying to figure out why the national works better than this one. So we're back to, I'm happy. This is the radio I sort of leave on my bench besides the DX390, the Radio Shack unit. And just want to tell you, this isn't a bad deal. Look at the size of this thing. Look at the size. And the dial is much bigger and more markings on it that are accurate. This is a piece of junk. Okay, and it's on an angle. It's on the. I don't like it. I don't like the radio. I loved it when I found out it was 1 microvolt, but now I got this one with that tube I told you to put in there, working better than this one because this has a noise problem. And I'm not going to add capacitors in there and a choke. This goes back on the pile. See, anytime I get a radio that performs better than another radio, I try to figure out why. Now with the Helicrafters, remember I hated them? That Helicrafters SX42 has a different IF cam for each of the IFs. It goes from wider to narrow. Later on, they went to with those generic square 455 IFs that are like out of a car radio or a kitchen radio. They really cheapen their radios up. I do not like Helicrafters, but the SX42, I was amazed how well it worked, and I was fooled by the radio. I thought there were two front end tubes that are on. Only one of the two is on. There's a set of coils. If you look at the schematic real quick, you think there's two RF amps on that radio. There is when you go up on a different band, but not on the AM broadcast band. So that's when I start thinking, okay, why can't I get this that good? And I started going through them. I have three of them, and one of them was outshining them, the other two. And it turned out to be, you have to change that resistor that goes up in value on the off the sensitivity control. It goes to the cathode of the first RF. I believe it's a 220 ohm resistor. It's well over 300 and something. And you got to change that back down to 220. Your tube will run hotter, and then change that tube, the first RF tube, to what I told you in one of the last videos, to making this more sensitive. And you'll have a pretty good radio. The next comes, where do you run your antenna? What kind of antenna? See, at some point, you can't make the radio any better for AM Dix. It comes down to making the antenna better. And that's where I wanted to get to. You have to understand this. You know, you can fall for all the advertisements. I won't tell you the names of the companies, but when you start trying to key in sensitive radio, you'll get this radio. The company's last name begins with a C. It is a good radio, and so is the Super Radio. But we're talking tubes. I have all the Super Radios. I have all three models. They're very good. But I do like tube radios once in a while. You know, like I said, I keep this one on the bench, and I actually have a mod where you can change the BFO to a product detector. I have to get back into that. I figured out how to do that. Just changing the tube and then adding a resistor and a capacitor. And you can turn one of the IF tubes by changing it to another model, a different tube. You could change it into a product detector for the BFO, so you get sideband. And I did that on one of my other radios, NC57. I actually built a BFO. Actually, I put another tube on a thing in there. I built a product detector. So when you go in the BFO CW, I think it's CW, yeah, CWO. When you go in that position, it switches in a product detector instead of the regular BFO. But this is my favorite radio, and the reason is I can tell you the guy's name. His name was Richard Masker. He needed money for his racing hobby when we were in Rets, and he sold me a National NC 125, and it was missing knobs. He told me it was brand new. It was already 15 years old or whatever. He meant the other radio. He sold two radios at the same time, and he got them mixed up. My other friend bought the other radio. I bought the National 125, and I did a lot of DXing. And I can tell you the year that I did the most DXing. It was the year the dogs come out and were barking jingle bells. I remember that I think I got laid off in RCA for Christmas. See, RCA towards the end, it would shut us down for Easter and Christmas, and they'd make the people that had vacation time take their vacation either at Easter and at Christmas. They shut the whole place down except for skeleton crew. And I was home, and it was dreary, and I was up in my room, and I built a 4-foot box loop, and I was DXing, and my father brought home a book from me, but I don't know if it was Food Fair or Pantry Pride, but they had a book section, and he brought home this blue book, and it had all the listings of AM and FM and television stations in the United States by state, by frequency. So every night, whenever I got each station, I put a little mark next to it, a little pencil mark, and then I would put a note in there, which station I got. All right, I would put a mark next to it, and then it would have a list of other stations. And then when I'd rotate the box antenna on certain nights, I could get one of the other stations, and I put a mark next to that. So I got heavily into AMDXing, but I want to tell you what's changed. Everything is either religious, political, sports, and there is some music now back on. But when I was DXing, I was in RCA probably 1973. AM broadcast stations at night. You could pick up bluegrass music, jazz. There were jazz stations. There were all kinds of music on, and then they all started becoming talk. Then they changed the rules. See, if you were going on there and talk about Democratic stuff, you had to give equal time to the Republicans. So they changed that law. So then all of a sudden, a bunch of these stations popped up where they only talk. It was like Rush Limbaugh and those people, and they got big. They became like franchised. So whenever you would DX at night, you would get that same network of stations up and down the dial. You didn't get the old station that's based on the section of the United States that it was in. And you get the music that was popular in that area. And the commercials would be for Bob's Auto Store. Stop at Bob's. Bob, and say, tell Bob we sent you. It was a whole different world than it is now. Now, when you get a station that mentions auto, it's probably Auto Zone or one of those Modern Order. Or that Modern Order was in Belleville. And I think it's still there. But anyway, things have changed for AMDXing, but it is pretty interesting to do. And I want to tell you about the elephant if you made it this far. There is an elephant in the room. And it's the fact that you don't need an AM radio anymore. You can stream everything using the internet or your phone. But I have such a passion for old radios, the circuitry. Like I told you, I found one of the bottom labels of this radio. It tells you what RCA, and they call it Radio Corporation of America. They don't even say RCA on it, and the patent number. And when you look at the circuitry, everybody had the same circuit. I mean, National, Hellcrafters. That's why once you get used to the circuit, when you look at it, you know how well it should work. And I know I had the NC 125. And this thing just wasn't doing it. And you know, I'm in a new area. I don't have my favorite 3 stations. I sort of do. And I realized I could get 3 stations on my DX390 and on the Hellcrafters SX42, and this wasn't getting it. And it wasn't getting it for one. The first reason was resistor. I could hear the carriers, but the resistor was changed value by 100 and something ohms. Once I changed that, the stations came up. I could hear the carrier. I could hear what they're saying, but I couldn't enjoy the programming. Then when I changed the tube and look at, I think I called it making a National NC57 more sensitive. And I tell you which tube to change to a different one. And that's one of the 3s I had, or one of the 3 I had. Someone had changed that tube. And then I went looking, and it said it's a hotter tube, you'll get more signal, but you can't use more than 1 in the radio. It might go into self-oscillation. I think that's it. All right, that's it.